What happens when nature's wrath collides with a state already teetering on the edge of a social crisis? In July 2025, Texas faced this grim reality as catastrophic flash floods ravaged central Texas, leaving a trail of destruction and despair. Homes vanished, lives were lost, and thousands were displaced, thrust into a growing nightmare, homelessness.
And we're working very close with representatives from Texas, and it's a horrible thing that took place. Absolutely horrible. So we say God bless all of the people that have gone through so much, and God bless the state of Texas. It's an incredible place.
This isn't just a story of rising waters. It's a tale of rising desperation, where the flood's devastation is amplifying an already dire homelessness epidemic. As a Texan who's seen this state weather countless storms, I'm shaken by the scale of this tragedy and its ripple effects on the vulnerable. Let's dive into this unfolding crisis and ask, how will Texas recover from a disaster that's drowning its people in more than just water? The Deluge, a biblical disaster, unfolds. On the 4th of July, 2025, Central Texas experienced one of the most devastating natural disasters in its history. In Kerr County, what began as a warm summer morning quickly turned into chaos. The skies opened, and within 45 minutes, the Guadalupe River rose over 26 feet, swallowing roads, sweeping away homes, and cutting off entire neighborhoods, before many even realized they were in danger. The flooding was so rapid, most families had no time to evacuate. The tragedy at Camp Mystic, a Christian summer retreat for girls, was among the hardest blows. 27 campers and staff members died. 11 more, most of them children, remained missing days later. That single event shattered hundreds of lives and sent a wave of grief far beyond the hill country.
The children, the little girls who were lost at Camp Mystic. That's every parent's nightmare. For the last several days, I've spoken to multiple parents, scared out of their mind. Do you know anything? Where is my daughter? There's still 10 girls and 1 counselor from Camp Mystic that are unaccounted for.
Across central Texas, the toll grew grim. At least 104 people were confirmed dead, including 28 children. Kerr, Travis, Williamson, Burnett, and Tom Green counties were hit the hardest. Emergency responders acted fast. Over 1,300 personnel, nearly 900 vehicles, and air support worked around the clock, rescuing more than 850 people. But the water moved faster than the warnings, and for many, the help came too late. Kerrville's city manager, Dalton Rice, acknowledged what residents feared. The region had no functioning flood warning system. Years of debate over cost and complexity stalled any real progress. So when the water came, people were caught off guard, many already living in poverty or on the brink of homelessness. For them, there was no emergency plan, no backup shelter, no safety net. Now, as another 4 to 10 inches of rain are forecasted and rivers remain swollen, thousands are displaced. Shelters are overwhelmed, and many who were already homeless before the storm are being pushed further into the margins. As the headlines fade, the question becomes painfully clear: what happens to those who had nothing, homeless in America, even before the flood hit? The homelessness crisis Texas was already facing. Before the first raindrop fell in July 2025, Texas was already grappling with a deepening crisis. The flood didn't spark a housing shortage. It collided with one already out of control. National data shows that 27,377 Texans were experiencing homelessness on a single night in 2023. That's roughly 4.2% of the U.S. homeless population, with only 4 states facing worse conditions. This isn't a sudden surge, but the outcome of over a decade of oversight. Since 2013, homelessness in Texas has risen by more than 20%, with a 5.6% increase from 2020 to 2023. Nearly half of those individuals, about 11,700, were living without shelter. They were sleeping on streets, under bridges, in vacant lots, or in tents hidden in wooded patches. Among them were over 3,000 unaccompanied youth, children navigating survival without guardians or support. So why is it getting worse? One big reason, there simply aren't enough affordable places to live. In cities like Austin, Houston, Dallas, and even smaller towns like Killeen or Bryan, rents have gone through the roof. A 1-bedroom apartment can now cost more than a full-time minimum wage job brings in. That leaves working families choosing between rent and groceries, and many are falling behind. Once they do, eviction comes fast. For some, the next stop is a motel. For others, it's a car or a friend's couch. Eventually, it's the street. Nonprofits and shelters do what they can, but the system is overwhelmed. Beds are full, resources are limited. Wait lists for supportive housing are months long. Many groups rely on donations and patchwork local funding that barely covers the basics. Mental health and addiction services, which could help thousands stabilize, are stretched even thinner. It can take months to get into a treatment program if you can find one at all. And this crisis doesn't hit everyone equally. Low-income neighborhoods, especially those where Black and Latino families live, have faced decades of disinvestment. These are often the same areas that flood first and recover last. It's not just about being poor, it's about being left behind over and over again. Then the storm hit. And it didn't just wipe out homes, it tore into communities that were already hanging by a thread. Now, with thousands more newly displaced and no affordable options left, we have to ask, what happens when the fragile system we had starts to collapse entirely? That's where the story goes next. When the floodwaters fell, the real crisis rose. When the water finally receded and the helicopters stopped circling overhead, what remained in central Texas was not just damage, it was devastation. Whole neighborhoods had been stripped away. Streets were buried in mud, trees upended, fences splintered like matchsticks. But underneath the physical destruction was something deeper, something more difficult to rebuild. The quiet collapse of people's sense of security and belonging. In cities like Houston, San Antonio, Austin, and Dallas, already under immense pressure from a growing housing crisis, the flood became the tipping point. These urban centers were already battling a shortage of deeply affordable housing, with shelters at or near capacity before the first raindrop even fell. Now, they were absorbing a second wave, families and individuals from Kerrville, Hunt, and Blanco, people who had homes just days ago, who now had nowhere to go and no idea what came next. Gyms, church halls, and school buildings were turned into makeshift shelters within hours. Volunteers worked overtime, handing out blankets, water, diapers, whatever they could. But within days, the cracks began to show. Supplies ran low, tempers ran high. Shelters became crowded and tense. People began sleeping in cars, under tarps, and in alleys near food distribution sites. For many volunteers, the burnout came fast. They were trying to do too much with too little. In the middle of all this, something subtle but painful began to happen. The line between the newly displaced and the chronically homeless blurred. It wasn't uncommon to see a family from a flooded subdivision sitting next to a veteran who had already been homeless for 5 years. They were now in the same food line, the same wait list for shelter beds, the same invisible category that so many look past. Homeless in America? And in rural counties like her, the situation was even more dire. Most small towns didn't have formal shelters to begin with. When the water came, people fled in whatever direction they could. Many ended up sleeping in their trucks at highway rest stops. Others made it to the cities, but brought nothing with them. Just the clothes they wore, their grief, and maybe a phone with a dying battery. The support system they needed didn't exist because in those quiet, low-tax communities, nobody had planned for this. So now the question becomes painfully clear. How do you rebuild not just a house, but a life, when the land you lived on, the job you worked at, the people you leaned on are gone? Emergency response or emergency delay. In the immediate aftermath of the July 2025 floods, the official response from both state and federal agencies came swiftly, but not always effectively. On the 6th of July, President Trump issued a major disaster declaration for the affected counties, unlocking access to federal emergency funds through FEMA. These funds included grants for temporary housing, home repairs, and low-interest loans for uninsured property losses. However, for thousands of displaced families, accessing this support became a frustrating ordeal. Victims were forced to wait in long lines, often in the heat, filling out paperwork multiple times only to face delays, vague answers, or outright denials. Many reported waiting weeks without hearing back, unsure where they would sleep each night. Governor Greg Abbott mobilized more than 1,300 state emergency responders and deployed dozens of search and rescue units throughout central Texas. Emergency hotlines like 211 were quickly overwhelmed by calls for shelter and assistance. Nonprofits, churches, and mutual aid groups scrambled to meet immediate needs. The American Red Cross arranged motel stays for survivors, while the Texas General Land Office provided short-term rental aid for those whose homes were completely destroyed. Yet the demand dwarfed available resources. In Kerr County alone, over 500 flood victims were placed on waiting lists for housing in just the first week. Despite the chaos, several local successes stood out. In Dallas, officials expanded the existing Street to Home initiative to serve newly displaced individuals and families. Austin transformed vacant city-owned buildings into emergency shelters almost overnight, offering clean water, meals, and temporary bedding. In Laredo, federal community development block grant CDBG funds were quickly redirected. $5 million was allocated for post-flood housing support within days. These actions, while commendable, remain isolated efforts in what was otherwise a fragmented response. What this tragedy revealed, yet again, is that Texas lacks a comprehensive long-term strategy to address climate-related mass displacement. The state continues to rely on a reactive system, one that only activates fully after lives have been lost and homes swept away. There are no scalable contingency plans for how to house tens of thousands after natural disasters, especially in regions where housing was already in short supply. If climate-related disasters continue, and they almost certainly will, Texas will have to decide whether it wants to prepare for the next flood or simply clean up the aftermath again and again. Because the truth is painfully clear, reacting after the fact is no longer enough. The cost of doing nothing. Before the first flood warning was issued in July 2025, cities like Dallas were already spending staggering amounts just to manage homelessness. A recent analysis estimated that Dallas and surrounding Collin County were spending $194 million per year, money that went toward emergency room visits, jail time, mental health crises, shelter beds, and lost economic productivity. And that was before the flood displaced thousands more across central Texas. Now, the math is changing fast and not for the better. In Houston, local officials say shelter budgets could triple in just one quarter. Cities are scrambling to reallocate funds from schools, road repairs, and healthcare programs just to meet the most basic needs: a bed, a meal, a clean pair of socks. The cost of doing nothing, of failing to address homelessness at its roots, is no longer theoretical. It's showing up in every overbooked shelter and every overworked case manager across the state. But the dollar signs are only part of the story. Across Texas, the storm has exposed deeper fractures in the social fabric. Encampments have become more visible, under bridges, beside playgrounds, outside libraries. Tensions are rising, not just among the unhoused, but within communities trying to respond. While many residents are calling for compassion, others are demanding tougher measures, stricter panhandling laws, camp sweeps, and increased police presence. These knee-jerk reactions risk turning a housing crisis into a public order crackdown and pushing the most vulnerable even further into the margins. Meanwhile, the people suffering most are often those who had the least to begin with: low-income families and communities of color. Many already living in flood-prone areas were hit hardest by the storm. With no flood insurance and no savings to fall back on, they're now navigating a system that offers few second chances. Their homelessness is not a result of bad choices. It's the outcome of broken systems. So the question isn't whether we can afford to act, it's whether we can afford not to. When disaster strikes, who do we choose to protect? And why are our public systems always the first to collapse when people need them most? Toward a stronger, fairer recovery. If Texas is going to recover, not just rebuild after the devastating floods of 2025, it will take more than temporary shelters and emergency grants. What's required now is not a bandage, but a blueprint, a long-term, values-driven approach that centers people, not politics. Because this storm didn't just tear apart homes, it exposed the cracks in a system that was already failing too many Texans. 3 priorities demand urgent attention: housing, mental health, and disaster readiness. First, let's talk about housing. We cannot treat it as a luxury reserved for the lucky. A state as wealthy and proud as Texas should be able to guarantee that people who work full-time jobs can afford a safe place to live. That means investing in deeply affordable housing, units that are actually within reach for those earning minimum wage or living on fixed incomes. We need to rethink outdated zoning laws incentivize development through tax credits, and restore flood-damaged properties into livable homes. Short-term shelter may keep people off the street for a night, but without permanent housing, families remain stuck in uncertainty, and too many never make it out. Second, mental health must be recognized as part of disaster recovery, not a footnote. Survivors of this flood are carrying invisible wounds. Many have lost not only their homes, but also their jobs, pets, communities, and sense of control. Grief and trauma don't go away with a dry pair of clothes. Texas must expand access to affordable counseling, crisis support, and long-term mental health care. Recovery isn't just about bricks and boards. It's about restoring people's will to keep going. Finally, we need to prepare for the next disaster, because there will be one. Many countries still don't have modern flood warning systems. Evacuation routes are unclear. Emergency shelters don't account for those without cars or stable housing. If we don't invest now, we will pay later in lives, in dollars, and in public trust. We must ask ourselves honestly, when the next storm comes, will we be any more ready than we were this time? Recovery isn't just a response, it's a responsibility. And what we do next will say everything about who we are as a state. Seven, a personal reflection. I've stood in neighborhoods where the air still smelled like river mud and ruin. I've spoken with a retired school teacher in Hunt who lost her home, her job, and the only dog she'd ever owned, all in one brutal afternoon. I remember the way her hands shook as she told me she taught fourth grade for 31 years and never thought she'd end up sleeping in a borrowed sleeping bag in a church basement. I've also shared quiet coffee with a man in Austin who'd been living beneath a bridge long before the flood arrived. He watched everything he owned, blankets, shoes, even a half-finished journal, swept away in minutes, but he didn't complain. He just looked out over the water and said, back to zero again. What I remember most from these moments isn't the broken wood or ruined cars, it's the look in people's eyes. A mixture of shock, pride, and something close to exhaustion. When you're unhoused, anything that feels remotely like safety becomes sacred. A tarp, a corner where no one yells at you. The flood didn't just wash away possessions. It shattered tiny islands of peace that had taken months or even years to build. We can't keep pretending natural disasters and human-made ones are separate. Homeless in America isn't just about tents and sidewalks. It's about policy choices, chronic neglect, and the stories we refuse to hear until tragedy forces us to listen. If we want to rebuild anything truly lasting, it has to begin with more than lumber and concrete. It has to begin with human dignity and the will to care before the next storm comes. Conclusion? The floods of July 2025 were a test, not just of Texas's infrastructure, but of its soul. In their wake, we are left with more than washed out roads and broken homes. We're left with a question, what kind of state do we want to be? One that sees its most vulnerable and acts, or one that waits until the next siren to care? If we treat homelessness as a storm we can't control, we'll never move forward. But if we see it as a crisis we created and can fix, then recovery isn't just possible, it's a duty. Will Texas rise to meet it?